Hello, everyone. This is Sarah Sladen, Director of the Youth Economic Opportunities Network at Making Sense International. The YEO Network is a global hub dedicated to preparing youth to learn, earn, and thrive in a changing world of work. And to support this goal, we provide year-round opportunities that connect technical experts through learning initiatives that highlight the latest tools and methodologies, facilitate impactful collaboration, and generate new partnerships. To date, the YEO Network has engaged more than 174,000 individuals globally through our activities. And today's webinar is part of the YEO Network's virtual engagement series. We are very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, co-hosted with our partner, the International Youth Foundation, IYF, and our speakers from both IYF and Hilton. We have 258 people registered from 37 countries for today's webinar, and we thank all of you for joining our discussion. Webinar participants, we welcome your questions and contributions throughout the webinar. To participate, please write your question in the chat box that's located at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We also welcome your tweeting and Facebook posts on key points you take away from this event, so be sure to use the hashtag GYEO in any post referring to the webinar. Finally, for those of you who are calling into the webinar from a landline, we're not able to mute you from our end, so please be sure to mute your phone so we avoid any background noise during the webinar itself. Our moderator for today's event is Ritu Sharma. She is the lead author of the 2017 Global Youth Wellbeing Index and Regional Director for Eurasia and Director for the Global Center for Gender and Youth at the International Youth Foundation. Prior to IYF and as founder of Women Thrive Worldwide, Ritu brought the voices of women around the globe to Washington's highest level decision makers. Ritu's advocacy was instrumental in the creation of the White House strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally and the USAID's Equality and Female Empowerment Policy in 2012. She is the author of Teach a Woman to Fish, Overcoming Poverty Around the Globe, a first-hand account of how women in developing countries are leaving poverty and how American women can help them the most. Ritu will introduce today's speaker and lead our discussion. So with that, Ritu, over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. And do you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I got kicked out a couple of minutes ago and I've logged back in, but just be aware I'm not sure why it glitched out. But hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're really excited to present to you our Global Youth Wellbeing Index. And what we'll do is I will run through the presentation and some of the results, and then Daniela Foster from Hilton will talk about why they supported the index and what they've been doing with some of the results and how that's informing their work on youth development. I'll show you a little bit about the data set and then we'll open it up to questions, but we want to run through the whole presentation first. So thank you for your patience. You can also type your questions in the chat box and our colleagues at Making Sense will collate them so that when we get to the Q&A, we can fit in as much as we can. So the Global Youth Wellbeing Index was actually created the first time in 2014. So the 2017 index is our second one. And the point of doing it was to identify where investments need to be made in youth development to try to help this current generation to thrive. As you well know, we've got the largest generation of young people, and we're just simply not investing enough to really have an impact at a large scale on the current generation of youth. So part of why we wanted to do this was to see if we have to prioritize, where should those priorities be set. So what is well-being? Now, well-being it's a multidimensional concept. It means many different things to many different people and institutions. This is how we defined it for the purposes of the index. It's physical and mental health, education, economic, physical safety, access to freedom, and participation in civic life. Again, this is just for clarity that this is our definition of well-being. Okay. So we looked at 30 countries around the world, and this is a map of those countries. I know you're going to ask me, how did you select those countries? This was based on regional diversity, income diversity, size of the country, and most importantly, availability of consistent data across this country, the country set. So it's 30 countries in 7 regions, and even though it's only 30 countries, it does represent 70% of the world's young people between 15 and 29. We do include India, Nigeria, China, Indonesia, Brazil. So we capture a majority of the world's youth by looking at these 30 countries. We looked at 7 domains, which you see listed here across the screen, and included 35 indicators. We'll be looking at these indicators in more depth. But it was quite a robust data set, as robust as we could really get based on the data sets we had access to. So what are the sources? It's really important to be transparent about the sources of data for the index. And the important thing is to know that all of the data came from highly reputable international institutions: ILO, World Bank, OECD, Gallup World Poll has a couple of data points in here. And a lot of this data actually originates with country statistical offices and is reported by countries to these international organizations. So as countries look at the index, it's important for them to know that this is not data picked out of the air. It's not data that has biases in it. It's very highly regarded and quite rigorous data. Now, 7 of the indicators, and at least 1 in each domain, comes from an IYF Millennial Viewpoint survey that we fielded in late 2016. It was of 7,600 young people across the index countries, and this was also supported by Hilton Worldwide, which was just tremendous. So what's unique about this index is that it's not just hard data points, which are obviously critical, but we wanted to include youth's own perceptions of their well-being as part of what calculates the score of the country. The opinion data doesn't make up the majority of the score. All told, it's about, including the Gallup poll, it's about 15% of the score is made up of the opinion data. So it's important and it's influential, but it doesn't sway the scores for countries just based on youth opinions. And what you'll see here as we present the data is that young people's opinions really vary quite widely from what the hard data would indicate that they're experiencing. So how does this map to the SDGs? A number of the SDG indicators are indicators in our index. And as you know, there's no one SDG on youth. There are indicators and goals spread across the SDGs that draw attention to youth or inclusive of youth. One thing we hope the index can do is at least be somewhat of a thermometer on how young people are doing within progress on the SDGs. It's not a perfect tool to measure that, but soon, probably in the next year or two, we'll start to see some of the data on progress on the SDGs, and it's unclear whether they'll pull out young people, that age group, and present it. So part of what we're trying to do is to really shine a light on young people within the Sustainable Development Goals. All right, so I'm going to just talk about the top 10 findings. There's so much richness in this data and in this data set, as you'll see, and we're really pleased that the data set is on the website, which is youthindex.org. You can download the Excel spreadsheet and you can play with it and explore it yourself, because it's sort of endless, the things you can pull out of it. So these are top 10 findings that we use to really influence our work and try to influence the field of youth development. We've pulled out things that we think are interesting, surprising, places where people are not paying enough attention. So the first one is that if we take the 2014 indicators and we simply update them for 2017, what we saw is that youth well-being is improving really slowly, about 2% over the course of those 3 years. So it's good news, it's great, it's improving, but it's just way too slow to have any appreciable, noticeable impact on today's young people. So that is one really important finding. Another one is that only 11% of young people are experiencing high levels of well-being. And I'm not going to go into this into detail right now on how high well-being was calculated. It's basically the top third of the range of scores. And these 11% of youth are mostly in highly developed countries. There's a very strong correlation between GDP per capita and youth well-being, partly because many of the determinants of youth well-being are resource intensive: health, education, and other things. So there is that strong correlation. But that said, even in the wealthy countries like the US, Australia, Sweden, Japan, there are areas where youth well-being is weak. So it's not a uniform, life is not wonderful for all youth in rich countries and terrible for all youth in poor countries. Quite the contrary. There's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of strong points in developing countries and a lot of weak points in developed countries. So the highest level of well-being, basically we looked at the scores across the domains, and countries generally scored the best in education. I think that is indicative of the investment that's been made in education over the last 30 years, really spurred by the Millennium Development Goals call for universal primary education. We did not look at quality. There are no good measures for educational quality that are consistent across countries. There is the PISA, there's a few other things that we use to measure learning outcomes, but those are not robust enough or consistent across countries. So we were only able to measure enrollment, secondary enrollment, secondary completion, percentage of budget allocated to education, etc. But what we do know is that the education young people are getting is not preparing them for work in life. There's a big skills mismatch between what employers want and what youth can offer. Most youth don't have the life skills to navigate transition to work, and most concerningly is they lack some of the resiliency and life skills to be able to deal with the life challenges that they are facing and will face. Interestingly, youth are really optimistic about their economic future, and maybe this is just the nature of youth, but almost 90% of young people we surveyed said, my standard of living will be better than my parents'. And there was an inverse correlation. So the lower income the countries, the more youth said their standard of living will be better. And that sort of makes logical sense. If your standard of living is low to begin with, you've got room to move. If you live in Germany and your standard of living is really high, it's probably unlikely that you'll top your parents. But still, we also looked at youth saying they think they can get the job they want, they think they can make as much money as they want, and at the same time countries were consistently the lowest in economic opportunities. So there is a huge gap between youth expectations for their economic future and where the indicators are headed. Young people overwhelmingly support women's equality, which of course I'm delighted about. And in our survey, about I think it was 98% is the highest levels of support for women's equality. A lot of consistency across countries, even in countries where they had, quote unquote, the lowest levels of support. It was still 75% supporting women's equality. We did compare this to other survey data and other polls, and it's quite consistent across that there is a lot of, sort of support in principle. When we take that into reality, or when you begin asking about application of that, you do see that go down. And I think where we are with women's equality is young people support it in principle, but we need to help them translate that into daily life. What does that actually mean on a day-to-day basis? Very, very critical. Young people really urgently need better access to mental health care. And I think that this is something that in the youth development space we tend not to pay attention to, partly because the other needs are so overwhelming and urgent. But if young people don't feel, if they're too stressed or they don't feel that if they feel the way if the way they feel gets in the way of doing their daily activities, which was one of the data points we asked young people, does the way you feel get in the way of work, school, or social life? And almost 50% of them said, yes, it does. And so that was very, very concerning to us. And so this is one thing we wanted to definitely pull out of the data and highlight for the field. For those of you who are familiar with the data around young people, by far, traffic-related accidents are the leading cause of death for young people 15 to 29 worldwide. Just it's not even close to anything else. And again, this is one where I think we tend not necessarily to focus on this. There's been a lot of focus on HIV/AIDS prevention, which is great, really important, but we're not yet focused on actually what's taking the lives most of young people. Too many young people don't feel that their government cares about them. This was another survey question that we asked, and quite low levels. I believe the average was 33% of young people think their government cares about their wants and needs. Not necessarily a shocking result, but concerning when you then combine it with the level of economic expectation and the poor performance of countries in economic opportunity. So when you look at these three things together, I think for us it really raises some alarm bells that governments really need to be getting more engaged. And of course, not just donor governments, national governments need to more positively engage their young people. No surprises here. Young people are using phones rather than computers. So cheaper, more accessible. Definitely, if you're looking at apps or things to reach young people, don't even necessarily bother designing for a computer format. Needs to be mobile. But I think one thing we have to recognize is that there is some loss in moving to mobile. It's not as robust a technology. It's sort of, for example, very difficult to take a massive online course on a mobile phone. It can be done, but a laptop or a computer is a much more robust interface. So that's just a reality that we need to keep in mind as we try to reach young people. And then finally, huge numbers of young people are using tobacco. And the highest scores were in Indonesia, which I just got back from Indonesia, and I can attest that it's unbelievable, and mostly young men. This is one that by far impacts young men more than young women. So Russia and Indonesia had the highest levels at 38% of young people smoking. And this is, as you all know, this is a giant train wreck coming, both in terms of what it's going to mean for young people's lives, what it means for country budgets, all kinds of different things. And again, tends not to be something that we pay much attention to. All right, so this is a chart of the overall country scores and ranks. And one thing that you will not see in our index is a list of the countries with their rankings next to them. That is because the scores are relatively close together. We have this yellow cluster at the top, which are the ones where there's high youth well-being. We have a cluster here at the bottom with low well-being. But this group of orange in the middle, between China and Thailand, there's a space of about, 12 or 13 ranks, but the scores are not that far apart. And so it's really important when looking at this set of data and this information that this is not a name and shame game. That was not the purpose of doing this. The purpose was to really identify where countries needed to focus their energies. And again, what we see here is, there's quite a close clustering of how youth are doing. We don't see these giant differences. Yes, between Sweden and Nigeria, there's a really big difference, but all the way in between, it's gradations. So that's the basic presentation of the data. This is all stuff you know. Half the world's population is under 30. You can learn more again at youthindex.org and hope you'll visit that site. So now I want to hand it over to Daniela Foster, who's one of the key people at Hilton working on CSR and was our close partner every step of the way in creating the index. And she's going to talk about how Hilton has been using this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. See if I can do that. Okay, I am out, and I think our friends at Making Sense are going to put up the presentation. Okay, I can see the presentation, but I'm not able to hear Daniela.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Wonderful. Well, hello everyone. My name is Daniela Foster. I'm the Senior Director of Global Corporate Responsibility at Hilton, and it's a pleasure to be virtually connected with everyone here today. I'm going to walk you through how Hilton invests in youth, and in particular, how we really use the index to inform our business decisions and the investments that we're making in the youth arena. So one of the important questions I think to address is why the index? Why did Hilton decide to invest in the index, and what was really the impetus behind it? For us, we want to ensure that anytime we're going to invest in anything, that we have good, solid data behind it, that we're making informed decisions, and we really wanted to understand, what the landscape of youth well-being looked like. And in particular, as Ritu mentioned before, we knew generally that the investment in youth vis-a-vis other issue areas was pretty minimal. And so we wanted to understand if there was additional data out there, how could that A, better inform decisions and investments around youth, but B, how could we get smarter around how we invest and also think about what the opportunities could be for collective investment. So at Hilton, we early on did our own material issues assessments to really look at what are the priority areas that we are going to focus on through Travel with Purpose, which is our corporate social responsibility program. And youth was one of those material issues that we had identified. And so for us, really having the data to understand where the greatest need is really critical. This, of course, is also kind of backed by the overall general landscape of what's happening with young people. So from a societal perspective, we know that unemployment, youth unemployment in particular, is a major issue in the global economy. That backed by some of the points Ritu talked about around half of the world's population being under 25. And we just felt that urgently there was a need to have a tool that would help other businesses, foundations, NGOs, donor agencies, country governments, etc., really figure out what's needed where. From our perspective, the other interesting backdrop is we look at this societal issue and then we said, well, what's the role for travel and tourism in our industry to help provide some kind of solution to this challenge? And what I think is interesting is if you look at travel and tourism, it employs 1 in 10 people worldwide. It's really the world's largest employer, and it's set to grow. So it's going to add 80 plus million new jobs to the global economy in less than a decade. So when you think about that against the backdrop of global youth unemployment, there's really a tremendous opportunity there to say, well, how do you mobilize this growing industry that's going to have a number of jobs available, and how can we, as an industry, mobilize together to provide soft skills, training, et cetera, to help close that skills gap and really bring young people into the fold and make them ready to take those jobs. So the other thing I would note here, just from sort of a business perspective, because I think this is important for us, youth issues are also really important for our CEO. It's a passion point for him. He's actually in the picture on the left of our CEO, Chris Nassetta. He himself has 6 daughters, so he's incredibly passionate about this issue, and he's been a real champion of figuring out how we as a business can support young people and really infuse it throughout our culture and what we do. And he's been very supportive of us pursuing the data piece as well. So what does this look like for Hilton? As Ritu mentioned, we've been partnering with IYF for quite a while. And in 2014, as we looked at how do we impact this space, we made what we call our Open Doors Pledge. And we committed to connect, prepare, or employ 1 million young people by 2019. I can tell you it's been keeping us incredibly busy. We've reached over 700,000 young people to date. And the way that we're doing this is we're really looking at it across a continuum. So we're looking at how do we connect with young people? So how do we provide them exposure to what careers in hospitality and in the industry look like? How do we help them understand what a career pathway looks like? So not just entry level, but that full progression. And then we've worked quite a bit around skills training and development, also mentorship. I'll talk a little bit later on about Passport to Success and how we've engaged with IYF on that program. And then third, we employ. So we right now, if you looked across our entire business, about half of our workforce is millennial. That's continuing to grow. In the Asia Pacific region, about 80% of our workforce is millennial or under. So we do hire a lot of young people already, which is great. And we're continually thinking about, in addition to hiring them, what are the other opportunities we can provide? How do we ensure that there's good wraparound services, for example, for vulnerable communities, which has been a priority for us as we think about, diverse workforce. And also, how do we ensure we retain young people and provide them with the opportunities they really need to grow? So this just gives you an example of that continuum that I was talking about. So in addition to connecting, preparing, employing young people, we've also been looking at the enabling environment, which is partially where the Global Youth Wellbeing Index comes into play. And one of the things, I always ask is again, what's the data that you really need to be able to get smart about how and where you invest? What are the policies that you need in place to ensure that young people flourish? And also, where are the opportunities for collective impact? So, one of the other things, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, is what are those very targeted opportunities for us all to work together, business, NGOs, government, foundations, et cetera, to really have a big collective impact, whether it's in a particular country or on an issue, apprenticeships, for example, et cetera. To give you another idea of how this fits into our business, it's pretty core to what we do. So, for Hilton, we're in over 100 countries. We have 360,000 team members around the world, so a really good kind of big footprint. And we serve over 160 million guests. What I think is unique about our industry is that we're an industry of people serving people. So at a time when you have a lot of businesses talking about automation, we know that A, we're going to continue to grow, and B, we need people. We're never, we're in the hospitality industry, so we're always going to need people. We don't intend to automate that piece of it. We'll innovate around the guest experience, but we're going to continue to need to hire really great talent. And I think what's interesting is that we're very flexible with the path that young people take to get to us. So we're very flexible in terms of saying, even if you haven't had a high school diploma, we have programs that can help you get there. And you don't have to necessarily know hospitality. We're happy to train you and teach you around that. It's really ensuring that young people are prepped and prepared with those life skills. So what does this mean in relation to the index? And I want to walk you here through a bit of how we at Hilton are using the data around the index to inform the investments that we're making in youth well-being. And I want to give you a window into the process that I've gone through to look at it and really to determine where do we start, right? There's a lot of countries on the index list, but how do we prioritize at least an initial set? So one of the things that I've done here is to look at, okay, which of the countries in the index are in the bottom 10 overall? And in particular, since we know that young people are doing the worst in economic opportunity, what are the countries that we know are in the bottom 10 for economic opportunity? And really, I overlaid that with the lens of where do we also have operations, where do we think we're growing, and where do we think we can uniquely have an impact. And that landed me on this list right here. So you have Egypt, India, Indonesia, Jordan, KSA, Nigeria, Morocco, and South Africa. So this is, my attempt to have that initial priority action list for countries. So that's not to say we're not going to do more in all of the countries, but it is just to say, as a starting point, these are some priority areas where we're going to focus. So once I identified this list, the next thing I looked at were what are the actions that we can take as a business to initially start to not only increase our investment, but increase the impact we're having on the ground. So the initial list of actions that we've been looking at across our operations in those countries that I just mentioned would look something like this. We would want every hotel to, number one, host what we call an open doors day in their community. And the idea behind that is really to open the doors to the property and the hospitality industry, welcome young people and others in, just to give them exposure and awareness to what a career in the industry could look like. And again, what are those pathways? What is that path forward? The second thing is we would like every hotel in those countries to partner with a youth organization in their community. And the idea behind this would be to offer workforce readiness training. So, it could be something like a passport to success or a youth career initiative. And then we would also like them to offer some structured work experience for young people. So they actually have exposure to the working world and to what, their day-to-day might look like. The third is we've really been thinking about this in terms of our existing team members, and we'd like our new line level team members to complete Passport to Success for new openings. So we've invested quite a bit in Passport to Success. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then the fourth is to commit to enhancing youth well-being by offering at least one well-being program to team members. So one of the things that we launched last year was Thrive, which is really focused on how do we ensure that our team members globally around the world are thriving, that they are thriving in mind, body, and spirit, we call it. So pretty, holistically looking at their well-being. And that's another thing we've been prioritizing at Hilton. So from here, I just want to give you a couple of country examples of how we've worked in various countries. So one example of this is in Mexico. So we have what's called the Prepa Hilton program, and that's really focused on providing degree equivalency programs for team members who haven't received their high school diploma, so providing them with the training and the support to build up to that and to sit for the exam. And we partner with IYF and CONALEP on that. Another example of a program that we're working on is China. So we're working on a program called Charity Futures, and it's really about kind of providing training and competition opportunities for university students in China, and with the ultimate goal of helping them lead on social impact projects in their community. We partner with the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation on this and IYF. It's still in phase one. We're really piloting it now, getting some good information and data and retooling it as we go forward. And then the last example is of Morocco. So we have a program in Morocco in partnership with the Ministry of Tourism, Silatech Foundation, and IYF. And it's all about providing sort of the soft skills, life skills training components to young people who are in vocational training centers across the country. So this has been a really interesting public-private partnership model. And again, I think it's interesting from the perspective of getting at that opportunity to really scale, to take what we're doing and to do it at scale, which I think oftentimes is one of the issues that we struggle with, and I think a lot of us struggle with. How do you scale some of these great efforts? So one of the things I want to touch a little bit on is passport to success. So we know that too many young people don't have the minimum level of basic skills needed to be gainfully employed. We also know that young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. And one of the big gaps for folks in industry is really ensuring that young people have the critical soft and life skills that they need. So we've focused quite a bit on this. Since 2013, we've partnered with IYF on the Passport to Success program, really building a hospitality lens onto that so that it's topical and relevant to the industry. And to date, we've reached over 10,000 young team members and youth in the community. Through the program, it touches on some great things. So it's really that foundational life skills training. So listening, goal setting, problem solving, critical thinking, learning how to adapt to ambiguity, which is in many ways the new norm in our world today. And I think what's been interesting about this is we've continued to adapt and innovate it. So when we first started working with IYF on this, we really had an in-person model. And then one of the pieces of feedback we got is, well, look, we'd like some online modules. So then we developed an online component as well. And then just last year, we released Passport to Success in a Box, which is a blended learning model. And again, the idea behind this is really figuring out what works. Every community is a bit different. The needs are a bit different. So really ensuring that we're providing those foundational skills, but the delivery mechanisms look a little bit different depending on the context that you're working in. One other thing that I think is interesting to highlight is that we did a bit of a survey around this to really understand what do supervisors whose direct reports have gone through Passport to Success, what do they say What are some of the things that they're noticing about the students who've graduated from the program? And a couple interesting points I've just put here. 80% have noticed on average that there's an improvement in skills, so an improvement in the skill of the employee. 96% have said that the graduates were retained by the company. That's incredibly important. Retention is a really big issue in our industry, but in many industries, and that's usually the golden nugget, how to figure out how you retain people over the long term. So that's a very promising number. And then 40% of those graduates were promoted into another role. So we have some strong data around and that's part of what's helping us and take this data, overlay it with the index, and say how do we really deliver this in the places that need it most, in the way in which they want to receive it. So what does that mean for the future? What are our future investments going to look like? A couple of things that I'll touch on. One that I think is incredibly important. We've always talked about youth development in terms of soft skills and discrete programs. I really think the future of closing the youth skills gap, as well as tackling global youth unemployment, is going to be looking at value chains and supply chains. And what I mean by that is businesses have traditionally looked at how do you engage young people through direct employment, which they should continue to do. I think that's incredibly important, but that's been sort of incremental, right? We've made incremental progress. And I think to make exponential progress and to really bridge that gap and start to holistically tackle youth unemployment, we have to look at supply chains. So how are we thinking about plugging young entrepreneurs into business supply chains? How are we thinking about the role of the digital and gig economy in supply chains? And for us in the travel and tourism space, there's a whole ecosystem. When we have a hotel in a community, we're in there for the long term. There's a whole industry around it. And there's a lot of opportunities to plug young people in across that entire value chain. So one of the areas that we're looking at in terms of future investment is how do we catalyze youth entrepreneurship and youth-led businesses or youth-inclusive businesses, and really bring them into the supply chain more broadly. So that's one area. Another specific example, we're doing quite a bit of work in KSA around women in work. So we are increasingly hiring quite a bit of women. We're very focused on promoting them as well and ensuring that they have solid career pathways at Hilton. And so we're going to be investing a bit more in women's empowerment in the region. You can expect to see some interesting announcements from us and other partners in the coming month, I would say, so stay tuned for that. Another thing that we're going to be focusing on again is the China program. So this is part of what I had mentioned earlier, but really looking at phase 2. What's the next step for the Charity Futures program? How do we really ensure there's social impact on the ground? How do we go to scale? All of those things. A couple of other things I would say as I wrap up, and then we'll get into questions. I also think a few other areas are going to just become incredibly important from a trend perspective. One is apprenticeships. We do quite a bit of that around the world. We're going to continue to do more globally, but that's, I think, one of those areas for collective impact. It's where policy, business, and NGOs can all come together. Another area I would say more on the innovation side is around digital badging and credentialing. So that's something else that we're looking at quite closely, right? The idea being that how do you provide young people not only with the soft skills they need to succeed, but with some form of digital badge that they can take with them no matter where they go, so that those skills are a bit more evergreen and are really going to grow with them. So these are just a few examples of things that we're going to be doing. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential to really have a collective impact. I know I keep talking about this, but I think it's really important. What are the countries and the issues that we can really all work together on? And I think part of what the index data does is it provides us with that data and the framework to really start to pinpoint where we can collaborate and the things that we can specifically collaborate on. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn it back over to the moderator, and we will open it up for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela. I think one of the best things about this is seeing how a major corporation actually use the data to inform programming. And I think that's what we really want to get across, is that the information here is very, very actionable. I want to show the data set, and in doing so, answer a couple of the questions that came up in the chat box. While I am pulling up that data set, there was a question about the survey data and how many people of the 7,600 responded. So that's a really easy question to answer. It was 7,600 survey completes. So we oversampled and then had 7,600, and it was balanced for sex, age, as close as we could approximate for income, etc. So that one I can knock out of the way. The second question that came up was on correlation. So what I want to do is just give you a little tour of this data set. What you can see here is there's a tab where you can explore the different indicators and get a sense of the country rankings and the country plotting. Let's see, that's going to come up. There we go. So you can take a look at that if you want to explore by indicators. Here we can look at correlations. So this funky chart that you're looking at, we can compare. I think the question was on, is there a correlation between youth well-being and basically citizen participation? So we can actually look at that by clicking on you can choose. And the R value for that is about 0.53, which is some correlation. It's not super strong. When you see a correlation that's about 80%, 80 or above, that's very strong. A 1-to-1 is a perfect correlation. So education to education is a perfect correlation. So there is some correlation there. Within citizen participation, you could even look at, let's see here. You could look at internal peace, the Global Peace Index, internal peace, and there's a negative correlation between that and the overall score. So in other words, the worse the internal peace score, the worse the overall score. So we could not obviously look at every variable in every area. So we are limited by the particular indicators that we had per each domain. So you can absolutely explore those here. We have a little bit of trend data that you can see. You can explore that. And then this is a really nifty one where you can compare two different countries. You can select a country and another country. This is comparing China and India. And then you can just get a quick comparison of how do they look vis-a-vis one another. You can also compare regions. So you can compare country to region, etc. So I'm going to stop there. I love this data set. I could go on forever and ever, but I don't think everybody on the phone is as much of a data geek as I am. So I hope that I answered those couple of questions, and happy to answer more. All right, so I think there were some questions, Daniela, for you in the chat box. Yeah, perfect. I can read them for you if you want.
Great. I'm just pulling those through right now. So a couple of questions. One I see is on youth retention. So yes, we absolutely do track this. One of the things that we've been doing globally is really tracking youth hiring as well as just sort of hiring from vulnerable populations. And so we do track youth hiring. We also track youth retention. We're, trying to get even smarter and smarter about it, of course, globally. And one of the other questions is when young employees leave, do they stay in the hospitality sector? I think it depends. Generally what I've seen is they tend to stay in travel and tourism. And it really depends on what role they were in the hospitality sector to begin with.
Great. So we still have a few minutes. If there are other questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. And there was a question about whether we'll share the presentations. Yes, I know Making Sense will have these on their platform, and the webinar is also being recorded. So you'll be able to access that and share it with others.
And I also see, I'm looking at trying to make it down the chat scroll here. Ritu, if you see any others, feel free to let me know what they are.
Here's a new one. How's the corporate sector going to increase the index on education for youth? I'm interpreting that to mean how will the corporate sector improve education? And then does Hilton account for gender imbalance in their definition of youth? Yeah, that one I can talk about with the data. Daniella, I don't know if you want to talk about that within the context of Hilton. I know that's something that you all look at in terms of diversity.
We do. I'm sorry, Ritu, what was the first question again?
So the first
education.
one was
yes, got it.
education. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, a couple of thoughts on that. I think one of the interesting pieces that comes out of the data that Ritu mentioned in her presentation is that one, young people are doing the best in education, and we do, think that that's likely because of increased country investments in education. But two, you can contrast that with the fact that young people are really doing the worst in economic opportunity. So there's clearly a gap there, right? And so the area that we're really focusing on is how do we address that gap, and particularly how do we address the skills gap so that young people are ready and have a foundational set of life skills that will help to serve them no matter where they go. We hope that they'll come into our industry and work with us, but even if they don't, the idea is that by helping them get trained in soft skills, they have a solid foundation that they can take wherever they need to go. So that's really been where we have focused and will continue to focus. And then on women in diverse populations, absolutely, that's a major priority for us. We have a number of women across our workforce, and we increasingly are looking at what I call inclusive growth. So as we grow as a business, how are we growing inclusively, and how are we ensuring that we're working with women, persons with disabilities, opportunity youth, really looking at ensuring that we're reaching out to vulnerable communities as well and providing them with opportunities. And we do quite a bit in that space. Ritu, do you want to pick it up from here?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Daniela. So there was a question, are there any big trends in gender differences across the indicators? Yes, there are. One thing I'll say is I would point you to the full report. The whole first section is on gender equality. And so we look at that as a specific domain, but also where there are big gaps between men and women in certain indicators. And really where we saw the biggest gaps are some of the economic opportunity, youth unemployment indicators in some countries where women's unemployment is much higher than men's, in some places vice versa, depending on the country context. Certainly tobacco use hugely weighted towards men. Road accidents also really weighted towards men. So for me, it was interesting because I think too often we think of gender as women, and that's really not the case. And what we wanted to do is look at how young women were doing and how young men were doing, and where are the places where young men face different challenges than young women. And I think the index is a great exploration of truly that gendered context for youth and not just the women's empowerment context for youth. Let's see. And then Daniela, a question for you. What is the cost sharing percentage with the local NGOs providing soft skills training for Hilton? Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, so on that, like I mentioned before, the majority of the soft skills training that we provide is really the Passport to Success program. We've invested in that. And like I mentioned before, we've invested in really innovating that. So having an online version, blended learning version, in person, etc. So we've really invested in that piece of things. And typically when we partner on the ground, with either local organizations or in some cases even local governments, etc. We usually provide that at no cost, because it's something that we're picking up. And really the point behind it is to build the capacity of the local community, and the local workforce so that they have the skills they need to succeed.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful. Yes. So the short answer on that is Hilton pays for 100% of it. That's the quick answer there, which is great. And then somebody asked about vulnerable populations, LGBTI, ethnic minorities. No. The only place that was looked at is in the Global Peace Index internal peace domain. That is an index done by the Institute, IEP Institute for Economics and Peace. They were actually our sort of technical partners on the project, and they do look at some of those rights in that index. So that was one way that we captured it. So it is 11:01, and I'm not sure our protocol here, if we are wrapping it up or if we have more time. So I'll leave it to our hosts to let us know that.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela and Ritu, and to everyone for joining today's webinar. In just a couple of moments, we'll direct you to our survey, and this will take less than 2 minutes of your time. We would really appreciate you filling this out so we can create the most relevant learning events for you going forward. There were a lot of questions about where to access this webinar and the resources shared. This will be posted on youtheconomicopportunities.org, and you'll receive a link to the recording via email as well. If you found this webinar useful, so will others in your network, so we encourage you to share the webinar recording and the resources. Thanks again so much to our presenters and to everyone for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.